Podbean, your message amplified.
Ready to share your message with the world? Start your podcast journey with Podbean.
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 Podbean. Podbean, the AI-powered all-in-one podcast platform.
Thousands of businesses and enterprises trust Podbean to launch their podcasts.
Launch your podcast on Podbean today.
My school uses Podbean.
My church, too.
I love it. I really do.
You are now listening to Mark's Unexplained World by Mark the Medium. Available on Apple Podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Podbean, and most other podcast platforms. Tonight's episode is about Chernobyl. So it's over to you now, Mark, for this week's explosive episode.
On the 26th of April in 1986, the number 4 reactor of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, which was located near Pripyat in the Soviet Union, which is now known as Ukraine, exploded. The response to the explosion involved more than 500,000 personnel and, at the time of the incident, an estimated cost of 18 billion rubles, which is now about 84.5 billion USD in 2025, and remains the worst and most expensive nuclear disaster in history, with an estimated total cost to date of around 700 billion US dollars. The disaster occurred whilst running a test to simulate the cooling of the reactor during an accident in blackout conditions, and when the operators carried out the test, despite the accidental drop in reactor power and also due to design issues, it actually resulted in a dramatic surge in power, and instead the reactor components ruptured and lost coolants, which resulted in steam explosions and a meltdown that destroyed reactor building number 4, which was then followed by a reactor core fire that spread radioactive contaminants across the Soviet Union and Europe. Within 36 hours of the accident, a 10-kilometre or 6.2-mile exclusion zone was established around the reactor, with the authorities initially evacuating around 49,000 people in the area. However, the exclusion zone was later expanded to 30 kilometres or 19 miles, which then resulted in the eventual evacuation of approximately 68,000 more people, with Pripyat itself being left completely abandoned, and a clean-up operation immediately instigated, which is currently scheduled for completion by the earliest date of 2065, which is still an incredible 40 years away. Greetings, Unexplainers. Thank you for tuning in once again and listening to this human cell damaging episode of Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I'm a medium, a ufologist, a true crime buff, and a man with a very dark and disturbed sense of humour who only realised the other day that I must be getting old because when I went to an antique auction the other day, 3 people started bidding on me. But just to give you a better idea of who I am and what I do, every week, usually on a Tuesday night, though occasionally on a Wednesday, allowing for bank holidays and busy weekends, I do a podcast on the many wide and various subjects that fall under the Unexplained banner. These include ufology, hauntings, disasters, and all sorts of other paranormal phenomena, including true crime, unsolved crime, serial killers, the darker side of some past celebrities, and the occasional missing person that often goes unnoticed. So if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review or an opinion of this episode subject that I can reply to, a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell. Or if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. And if you get a few minutes, perhaps you might like to check out my social media groups and pages, including Facebook, Instagram and TikTok, which are filled daily with all things unexplained and crime, so I'll put the links to some of my socials in the description. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the "Oops, I think we screwed up here, guys" story surrounding Chernobyl. And this week's necessary disclaimer: this story is a tale that sadly involves people dying through misadventure, so it may prove upsetting to some, and although you listen to this show at your own discretion, please remember that all opinions and comments on this podcast are strictly my own, and that the facts of the case remain. I also apologise if I pronounce anything correctly, but while I have your attention, the other day I asked a paranoid person to change the light bulb for me, and all he said was, "Why? Who wants to know?" Anyway, let us get back to the story. According to Wikipedia, Pripyat is an abandoned industrial city in Kiev Oblast in Ukraine, located near the border with Belarus, with it being named after the nearby river. It was founded on the 4th of February in 1970 as the 9th Atomgrad, or Atom City, which is a type of closed city in the Soviet Union that served the purpose of housing nuclear workers near a plant catering the nearby Chernobyl Nuclear Power Station. Pripyat was officially proclaimed a city in 1979 and had ballooned to a population of 49,360 by the time it was evacuated. And although it is located in the districts of Vyshhorod Raion, the abandoned municipality is administered directly from the capital of Kyiv, with it being supervised by the State Emergency Service of Ukraine, which manages the activities for the entire Chernobyl exclusion zone. And following the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear disaster, the entire population of Pripyat was moved to the purpose-built city of Severity. Okay, Unexplainers, I am probably going to get a little bit techie here, so do bear with me, although I have simplified it enough to the degree that even I understand it, and that is saying something, believe me. But anyway, here goes. In a nuclear reactor operation, most of its heat is generated by what's known as nuclear fission, but over 60% of this hotness actually comes from what's known as radioactive decay heat, which continues to run after the reactor is shut down, with this continued coolant circulation being essential to prevent either the core overheating or even a total core meltdown. You with me so far?
Yeah, I think so.
Good, because I'm just getting started. The RBMK reactors, which, although it is an abbreviation for a type of reactor in Russia, believe you me, there was just no way I could pronounce it without insulting someone. So in English, it simply stands for the high-powered channel-type reactor. Like those at Chernobyl, use water as a coolant, which is circulated by using electrically driven pumps. And reactor number 4, which is the atomic furnace in question, had 1,661 individual fuel channels, requiring over 45 million litres, which is 12 million US gallons, of coolant per hour for the entire reactor. In the case of a total power loss, each of Chernobyl's reactors, of which they had 4 in total, had 3 backup diesel generators, but they would take between 60 to 75 seconds to reach full load, so as to generate the 5.5 megawatts of power that was needed to run one main electrically driven pump. So there were special counterweights on each pump that provided coolant via inertia that were able to bridge the time gap to the generator startup. But it was not without its hazards, and a potential safety risk did exist. For example, if the coolant pipe simultaneously ruptures during the event of a station blackout. However, in this scenario, the emergency core cooling system, or the ECCS for short, would then be used to pump additional water into the core, with it being theorised that this rotational momentum of the reactor steam turbine being used to generate the required electrical power to operate the ECCS via the feedwater pumps. So the turbine speed would then run down as energy was taken from it, with the analysis indicating that there might be just sufficient enough energy to provide electrical power to run the coolant pumps for 45 seconds. And although this would not quite bridge the gap between an external power failure and the full availability of the emergency generators, it would certainly help alleviate the situation. So, the big question is, what went wrong? Well, a turbine rundown energy capability was still needed to be confirmed experimentally, and previous tests had ended unsuccessfully, with an initial test carried out in 1982 indicating that the excitation voltage of the turbine generator was insufficient, so the electrical system was modified and the test was repeated in 1984, but again proved unsuccessful. In 1985, the test was conducted a third time, but again also yielded no results, mainly due to a problem with the recording equipment, and so the test procedure was set to be run again in 1986, and was scheduled to take place during a controlled power down of reactor number 4, which was preparatory to a planned maintenance outage. And although a test procedure had been written, the authors of said procedure were not aware of the aforementioned reactor behaviour under the planned operating conditions, and as it was regarded as purely an electrical test of the generators, they weren't aware that it also involved critical unit systems, and because of this, according to the existing regulations, such a test did not require approval by either the Chief Design Authority for the reactor or the Nuclear Safety Regulator. So, all the test programme called for on disabling the emergency core cooling system was a passive or active system of core cooling, which was intended to just provide water to the core in a loss of cooling accident, which only required the approval from the site chief engineer, which, according to regulations, had been obtained. After this first short break, in part 2 we will look at the start of the test programme for reactor number 4 and the unfolding disaster that followed.
Dare to discover the unknown? Book your own paranormal investigation at HAPRA 2026. The Haunted Antiques and Paranormal Research Centre, HAPRA, are now taking 2026 bookings, and your next supernatural adventure is just a £50 deposit away. New for 2026, we have upgraded. Our location now features improved sound insulation on all our windows, making it easier than ever to hear what should not be there. Bring your team, bring your equipment, explore the unexplained, record the impossible. Limited slots available, so secure yours now. Book now, believe later. HauntedResearchCentre.com.
The test programme for reactor number 4 was due to be conducted during the day shift on the 25th of April as part of a scheduled reactor shutdown, with them being instructed in advance on the reactor operating conditions to run the test, along with a special team of electrical engineers who were present to conduct the electrical test once the correct conditions had been reached. And as planned at 0106 in the early hours overnight, a gradual reduction in the output of the power unit began, and the power level had reached 50% of its nominal 3,200 megawatts thermal level by the beginning of the day shift as planned. The day shift was scheduled to perform the test at 14:15, and so preparations for it were carried out, which included the disabling of the emergency core cooling system. Meanwhile, another regional power station unexpectedly went offline, and at 1400 hours, the Kyiv electrical grid controller requested that the further reduction of the Chernobyl's output be postponed, as the power was needed to satisfy peak evening demand. Soon the day shift was then replaced by the evening shift, and despite the delay, the emergency core cooling system was left disabled. And remembering that this was way back in 1986, this particular system had to be disconnected via a manually isolating slide valve, which meant in practice that 2 or 3 men spent the whole shift manually turning sailboat-sized helm valve wheels. I think it's probably worth me pointing out here that although the emergency core cooling system was left disabled, it didn't actually have any influence on the disaster itself, but allowing the reactor to run for 11 hours outside of the test without any emergency protection was indicative of the general lack of the safety culture at the time. We now move on to 23:04, which is just after 11 p.m, and the day shift had long since departed, the evening shift was also preparing to leave, and the night shift would not take over for another 56 minutes, and so the Kyiv grid controller allows the reactor shutdown to resume. According to the plan, the test should have been completed during the previous day shift, so that the night shift would only have to maintain the decay heat cooling systems in an otherwise shut down plant. However, the night shift had very limited time to prepare for and carry out the experiment. On a very quick, interesting side note here, decay heat is the heat released because of radioactive degradation, or the heat which is produced as an effect of radiation on materials. The personnel who were overseeing the test were Anatoly Dyatlov, who was the Deputy Chief Engineer of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, one of the test chief's authors, and the highest-ranking individual present, Unit Shift Supervisor Alexandra Askimov, excuse the dogs there, who oversaw the unit for night shift, and Leonid Totugnov, who was the Senior Reactor Control Engineer, who was responsible for the reactor's operational regime, which also included the movement of the control rods. So it is now 01:23:04, and the test begins with 4 of the 8 main circulating pumps being powered by voltage from the coasting turbine, and the remaining 4 pumps receiving electrical power from the grid as normal, followed by the steam to the turbines being shut off, thus beginning a full rundown of the turbine generator. The diesel generators then started and sequentially picked up loads, with the generators themselves to have completely picked up the main circulating pump's power needs by 01:23:43, just 39 seconds later. As the momentum of the turbine generator decreased, so did the power it produced for the pumps, and as the water flow rate decreased, this then led to the increased formation of steam voids in the coolant flowing up through the fuel pressure tubes. And while all this was going on, just as the experiment was wrapping up at 01:23:40, a scram, which is otherwise known as an emergency shutdown of the reactor, was initiated, which was started when the AZ5 button of the reactor emergency protection system was pressed, which then in turn engaged the drive mechanism on all the control rods, including the manual control rods that had been withdrawn earlier, to fully insert. And as the injecting control rods went down into the reactor, it then displaced neutron-absorbing water into the lower portion of the fuel channel with neutron-moderating graphite, which then increased the reaction rate in the lower part of the core, and so consequently, a few seconds later, a power spike occurred and the core overheated, causing some of the fuel rods to fracture. This power spike would then have caused an increase in fuel temperature along with a steam build-up, leading to a rapid increase in steam pressure, which would have caused the fuel cladding to fail, releasing the fuel elements into the coolant and then rupturing the channels in which these elements were located. As the scram, which again is otherwise known as the emergency shutdown, continued, the reactor output that would have been indicated on the control panel in front of them then jumped to around 30,000 megawatts thermal, which is 10 times its normal operational output, although it has been estimated by some that the power spike may have gone 10 times higher than that. I think it's only right at this moment to point out that it was not possible to reconstruct the precise sequence of the process that led to the destruction of the reactor and the power unit building, but according to reports, a steam explosion does appear to have been the next event. The general understanding is that it was the explosive steam pressure from the damaged fuel channels escaping into the reactor's exterior cooling structure that caused the explosion that destroyed the reactor casing, tearing off and blasting the upper plate called the upper biological shield, to which the entire reactor assembly is fastened, through the roof of the reactor building, believing to be the first explosion that many people heard. This explosion then ruptured further fuel channels, as well as severing most of the coolant lines feeding the reactor chamber, and as a result, the remaining coolant flashed to steam and escaped the reactor core. That, and the total water loss combined with a higher positive void coefficient, further increased the reactor's thermal power. Thus, a second, more powerful explosion occurred about 2 or 3 seconds after the first, with this explosion dispersing all the damaged core and effectively terminating the nuclear chain reaction and compromise more of the reactor containing vessel, along with the ejecting hot lumps of graphite, with this ejected graphite along with the demolished channels still in the remains of the reactor vessel catching on fire on exposure to air, which significantly contributed to the spread of radioactive fallout. This second explosion was estimated to have had the power to the equivalent of 225 tons of TNT. As a result of the damage to the building, an airflow through the core was established by the core's high temperature, which then ignited the hot graphite and started a graphite fire, which, according to some observers who were outside of Unit 4 when all this was going on, burnt lumps of material and sparks came shooting out into the air above the reactor, then fell back onto the roof of the machine hall and started more fires, with about 25% of the red-hot graphite blocks and overheated material from the fuel channels along with the reactor building being ejected. After the larger of the explosions, meaning the second one of course, several employees at the power station then went outside to get a clearer view of the extent of the damage that it had caused, with one such survivor named Alexander Yachenko saying that once he stepped out and looked up towards the reactor hall, he saw a, and I quote, very beautiful laser-like beam of blue light caused by the ionized glow that appeared to be flooding up into the infinity. There were initially several hypotheses being bandied about regarding the nature of the second larger explosion, with one view being that the second explosion was caused by the combustion of hydrogen, which had been produced either by the overheated steam zirconium reaction or by the reaction of the red-hot graphite mixing with the steam, which would then produce a mix of hydrogen and carbon monoxide. On a short interesting side note, apparently if you mix hydrogen and carbon monoxide together, you produce what is known as water gas, which is defined as fuel gas, which, judging by the aforementioned explosion, can't be a good thing, right? And another hypothesis by the physicist at the Kurchatov Institute, I apologise to everybody who goes there, a Konstantin Chekarov, that was published in 1998, was that the second explosion was a thermal explosion of the reactor due to the uncontrollable escape of fast neutrons caused by the complete water loss in the reactor core. I think he means, in layman's terms, that it overheated. But maybe I'm just oversimplifying things here, but as usual, I digress. After this second short break, in part 3, we will look at the evacuations and clean-up operations in Pripyat.
Fright Nights was established in 1999 as the first company in the world to offer overnight ghost hunt experiences to the general public, pioneering paranormal events since the last century. Fright Nights operate at hundreds of the UK's most haunted and exclusive venues. All events have their own team of experienced paranormal investigators, mediums and psychics. They have a VIP members club for regular returning guests, offering loyalty discounts and exclusive invitation-only events. They can also host private events for your family and friends. You can contact them on 07852 998 628 or email them at office@frightnights.co.uk. Or take a look at their website at www.frightnights.co.uk, where you can see the many locations they investigate and learn about them and the opportunities they have available. Hundreds of ghost hunters join Fright Nights every month for the most thrilling ghost hunting experiences they'll never forget. If you haven't been on a ghost hunt before, then why not join them to see what it's all about? Why not visit their social media sites for up-to-date information on all the places they visit and to see what's coming up in the future? They look forward to seeing you all soon. Fright Nights Ghost Hunting Events. Remember, only the original will do.
The nearby city of Pripyat was not immediately evacuated, and the townspeople were not alerted during the night to what had just happened. However, within just a few hours, dozens of people fell ill with reports of severe headaches, metallic tastes in their mouth, and uncontrollable fits of coughing and vomiting. And as the plant was run by the authorities in Moscow, the government of Ukraine did not receive prompt information on the accident itself. The chairwoman of the Presidium of Yukhanova Rada, or the Parliament of the Ukraine, Ms. Valentina Shevchenko, said that Ukraine's acting Minister of Internal Affairs, Mr. Vasyl Dudinets, phoned her at work at 9 a.m. on the same day as the incident to report any current affairs, and it was only then at the end of the conversation, when he did add that there had been a fire at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, that it was now extinguished and that everything was now fine. And when Valentina Shevchenko asked him, "How are the people?" he replied that there was nothing to be concerned about, saying that, and I quote, "Some of them are celebrating a wedding, others are gardening, and others are fishing in Pripyat River." Valentina Shevchenko then spoke by telephone to the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine and Head of State, one Volodymyr, I can't even pronounce that last name, Shabitsky, could be it. Yeah. And it was later that same day when a commission was established to investigate the accident. The commission then flew to Boryspil International Airport and arrived at the Chernobyl power plant on that same evening of the 26th of April. However, by that time, 2 people had already died and 52 were hospitalised. The delegation soon had ample evidence that the reactor was completely destroyed. Seriously, you think? And that extremely high levels of radiation had indeed caused several cases of radiation exposure. So in the early daylight hours of the 27th of April, they ordered the evacuation of Pripyat. To expedite the evacuation, the residents of Pripyat were told to bring only what was necessary and that they would remain evacuated for approximately 3 days. So as a result, most personal belongings were left behind, with the residents later being allowed to have the opportunity to recover other certain items after a few months had passed. And by 1500 hours, or 3 p.m, 53,000 people were evacuated to the Kiev region. However, the next day, talks began for evacuating people within a 10-kilometre or 6.2-mile exclusion zone, which was then expanded again 10 days later to a 30-kilometre or 19-mile exclusion zone, to which it has remained ever since, although over the years it's changed its shape and its size has expanded somewhat. The surveying and detection of isolated fallout hotspots outside of this exclusion zone over the following year eventually resulted in 135,000 long-term evacuees in total, and the years between 1986 and 2000 saw the near tripling in the total numbers of residents permanently resettled from the most severely contaminated areas to approximately 350,000. Today, a new city of Slavitik has been built across the Dnieper marshes to house the power plant employees, with a direct rail connection to the Chernobyl NPP. In the months that followed after the explosion, attention was turned to removing the radioactive debris from the roof of what was left of the plant, and while the worst of the radioactive debris had remained inside what was left of the reactor, there was an estimated 100 tons of debris on the roof that had to be removed to enable the safe construction of the sarcophagus, which was a concrete structure that would entomb the reactor and reduce the radioactive dust that was continuously being released. The initial plan was to use robots to clear the roof. However, many failed due to both the difficult terrain and the combined effects of the high radiation fields on their batteries and electronic controls. So consequently, the most highly radioactive materials had to be shoveled by Chernobyl's very own liquidators from the military, whilst they were wearing protective gear, earning them the nickname of bio-robots. However, due to the extremely high radiation levels, these soldiers could only spend a maximum of between 40 to 90 seconds working on the rooftops of the surrounding buildings. So, in the end, only 10% of the debris was cleared from the roof, was performed by robots, and the other 90% was removed by 3,828 men who absorbed, on average, an estimated dose of 25 rem of radiation each. And just to give you some idea of how harmful that is, 25 to 50 rem would cause definite blood change but no serious injury. 50 to 100 rem would cause some possible injuries. 100 to 200 rem would give you an injury and a possible disability, and 200 to 400 rem would give you possibly an injury and disability or death, and anything higher than that I think speaks for itself. The potential deaths from the Chernobyl disaster over the years are very heavily debated, with the World Health Organization predicting 4,000 future cancer deaths in the surrounding countries based on the linear no-threshold model, or LNT for short, which assumes that even low doses of radiation increase cancer risk proportionately. And the Union of Concerned Scientists estimated that there would be approximately 27,000 excess cancer deaths worldwide using the same LNT model. And a study by Greenpeace estimated between 10,000 to 200,000 additional deaths in Belarus, Russia and Ukraine from 1990 to 2004. However, this report was criticised for relying on non-peer-reviewed studies. And in the publication, Chernobyl, Consequences of the Catastrophe for People and the Environment, it claimed that there were 985,000 premature deaths, but this figure was criticised for bias and using unverified sources. From what I can research, much like the death count, it also appears to be difficult to establish the total economic cost of the Chernobyl disaster. But according to Mikhail Gorbachev, who in December 1991, the Soviet Union spent 18 billion rubles, which is 5.9 billion in today's dollars, on both the containment and decontamination of the area, virtually bankrupting itself. And in 2005, the total cost over 30 years for Belarus was estimated at $235 billion, with Mikhail Gorbachev later writing that, and I quote, "The nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union." And even today, the ongoing costs still remain significant, as in their 2003 to 2005 report, the Chernobyl Forum stated that between 5 and 7% of government spending in Ukraine is still related to the Chernobyl disaster. First limited guided tours of the area began in 2002, and tour operators estimated that 40,000 tourists visited the site between 2007 and 2017, and between 2017 and 2022 it had over 350,000 tourist visits, hitting its maximum peak of almost 125,000 visitors in 2019, which coincided with the release of HBO's excellent miniseries about the disaster. And after the miniseries was released in the July of 2019, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky announced that the Chernobyl site would become an official tourist attraction, saying, and I quote, "We must give this territory of Ukraine a new life." Tourism rebounded after COVID in 2021, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early 2022 meant the Chernobyl area saw active fighting, and so the exclusion zone was closed to all visitors, and it remains closed to tourism as of the summer of 2025.
Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. In our next episode, show number 168, we are going to be looking at the dark story behind Tony Hancock. Anthony John Hancock was an English comedian and actor. Across his career, Tony Hancock twice won the BAFTA Award for Light Entertainment Artist and was later nominated for the BAFTA Award for Most Promising Newcomer. However, many stars often said that Tony Hancock was an extremely difficult man to get on with, as he used to drink excessively, and in the June of 1968, at the age of just 44, Hancock committed suicide. He was found dead in his Bellevue Hill flat in Australia with an empty vodka bottle and a scattering of amobarbital tablets.
This show was written and researched by myself, Mark Hughes, and proofread and edited by Linda Hughes. The pronunciations of all those Russian names, of course, was me. The actors in this episode were Mark Hughes, Linda Hughes and Denise Poolar, with special thanks to Neil Packer and the staff at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Hinckley, and of course a big thank you to everyone for listening. We never run out of ideas here at the office for Mark's Unexplained World podcast, but if you do know of any other intriguing stories under the Unexplained banner, including ufology, hauntings, disasters and any other sort of paranormal phenomena any more paranormal phenomena, as well as true crime, unsolved crime and missing people, do drop me a direct message and I'll see what I can do. I'll also include the name of the person who suggested the idea in the end credits of the podcast, if they're happy for me to do so, of course. And again, just to add, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. I thank you in advance. Mark's Unexplained World, because there's more to the paranormal than meets the third eye. And remember, guys, keep it real, because being real is better than being perfect. No AI was used or harmed in the making of this or any other episode of Mark's Unexplained World. This show and all its contents are covered by basic copyright of Mark the Medium.